We know that since GraphQL is a strongly typed system, it can determine whether our queries or other GraphQL operations are valid according to whether the data that we've provided matches the types that have been established in our schema. If they don't correspond, if we put in the wrong data types, it's going to return to us an error. So we've been implementing error handling throughout our application in addition to the errors that GraphQL shows us by default if there's a mistake in our queries or mutations. We've been raising exceptions throughout our two schema files if, for example, our user is anonymous or if the user doesn't correspond, the current user doesn't correspond with the user that created a given track, etc. Now, raising exceptions are a totally valid way of performing error handling. However, it's worth noting that GraphQL also makes available to us a special class that we can use to raise errors called a GraphQLError. We can import this class up at the top of either one of our schema files by saying from GraphQL import GraphQLError. And there's very little difference in using this GraphQLError class as compared to our exception. We can just replace exception with GraphQLError, and we can still pass in the error message that we like as a string. So if you're using VS Code, we can do a global search and replace, find and replace, by first finding everywhere that we use the keyword exception with Command F. We can search for exception, and we can replace it with GraphQLError by hitting this arrow right next to the input. And we're going to replace exception globally with GraphQLError, spelled like this. And we can do a global replace with this second button here. If you highlight over it, it should say replace all. And when we click on it, every instance where we previously used exception should now be replaced with the keyword with the class GraphQLError. And we can do the same within our other schema.py file within our users folder. We can find wherever we used exception and replace that with GraphQLError globally. So now let's save both of these files and test out this manner of error handling. We'll head to Graphical and we'll try performing an operation that we know is going to return an error, especially since we can't authenticate ourselves within Graphical. So for example, let's try executing our delete track mutation. We'll pass in some track ID, and when we hit the play button, we should still get our error message that we specified, not permitted to delete this track.